This presentation on challenges in conceptualizing urban climate vulnerability in the northeast region of Thailand is based on a study that is part of a 5-year project on strengthening urban climate governance funded by the European Union. The project focuses on building the capacity of local civil society organizations to play a key role in driving inclusive and equitable urban development and climate actions. As we are aware that cities, especially in the global south, are rapidly urbanizing. Cities are faced with increasingly complex problems and challenges that are exacerbated by the effects of climate change. So in order to adapt to climate change, we have to understand and assess social vulnerabilities to disasters and climate impacts in the city. To effectively manage urban risk and address social vulnerabilities to climate change, and the literature suggests looking at inherent vulnerability as a dynamic process based on the decreasing ability of a city or its populations to cope with hazards, stresses, shocks, and crises. The decreasing ability is driven by the underlying social, economic, political, and institutional conditions. The literature also suggests heroes are played by local and city governments in managing risk, and improving urban governance is crucial in addressing climate vulnerabilities. We agree with climate research and literature that there is an urgent need to improve urban governance and strengthen the capacity of local and city governments to manage urban risk, reduce vulnerabilities, and implement climate actions in the city. But in practice, we argue that in order to better understand urban risk and social vulnerabilities in the city, we need to rethink new forms, patterns, and processes of urbanization that are driven by different social, economic, and political pressures at different scales, so at local, national, and international scales. With urbanization, spatial boundaries, administrative boundaries of cities within a region are becoming fuzzy and blurry. And through the construction and production of city regions, and new urban and political actors are created, and they are becoming more diverse. In order to deliver social, economic, and large-scale infrastructure development, new forms of institutional arrangements are created. These institutional arrangements are multiscalar and are complex. With diverse actors and complex institutional arrangements, then power relations are multiple, overlapping, relational, and tangled. To illustrate our arguments, we are using Thailand as a case study. So social and economic development policies are framed under the 20-year national strategy. These policies are driving urbanization across the country with an aim to lift the country out of the middle income trap and to gain an upper middle income status. So the development plans focus on the construction of large-scale transport infrastructure based on existing economic corridors linking countries in the Greater Mekong sub-region. So networks of dual track and high-speed trains along the economic corridors will link ASEAN countries to China. Special economic zones across the Mekong countries are strategically positioned along the economic corridors and are linked by new networks of railway. So the development of transport infrastructure and special economic zones in these countries is driving urbanization and will have significant social and environmental implications on patterns of risks and vulnerabilities. Our study focuses on 3 provinces in the upper northeast of Thailand. Historically, these provinces are agricultural areas. Khon Kaen was then positioned to be a regional hub for government offices of university and economic development in the northeast. So Don Thani City was then set up as a strategic U.S. Army base, and so Nong Khai as a border province has been designated for the development of special economic zone. So these provinces have long been connected by a major road from Bangkok, and as development plans for railway are being implemented, new cities are emerging. Cities in these provinces, actually cities across Thailand, are rapidly urbanizing without land use planning. So most city comprehensive land use plans are out of date. Urban sprawls are unregulated, driven by land speculation that increases land prices. Transformation of rural agricultural areas is changing ecological landscapes and hydrological patterns through filling in of wetlands and waterways. So cities like Udon are planning to double in size through a plan for the construction of a second ring road, as seen in red around the urban center. So urban expansion will be outside of the existing land use plan. The dimensions of urbanization processes exceed the confines of the traditional city. The development of new transport infrastructure, such as roads and ring roads, so leads to more transformation of rural areas through land speculation that increases land prices. The urbanization process is diminishing the traditional rural-urban divide. It also changes patterns of risk and creating new risks. The cities and regions are transforming into sites of networks of organizations, financial institutions, public and private actors. So as the central government set development agendas, we need to look at the new configuration of the scales that govern state power. National state institutions are operated in new institutional arrangements that are complex and multi-scalar. The power relations are multiple, overlapping and entangled, so local governments have limited remits. So to understand urban processes, we need to trace the different lines of authority, negotiation, and engagement, and how they crisscross one another in terms of their spatial practice. So this means regional governance arrangements would involve central government agencies position themselves to engage with and cut across region as well as local lines of decision making. To understand vulnerabilities of the urban poor and informal settlements, it's not simply just looking at the socio-economic impacts of climate on poor and vulnerable communities. While it is true that we must address structural causes of poverty to increase the adaptive capacity and resilience of the poor and vulnerable community groups, we need to look further into urban and political actors and the new institutional arrangements that are driving urban processes and patterns of inequalities. So this informal settlement in Khon Kaen has been living along the railway track for 50 to 60 years. They are vulnerable to climate impacts, not only because they're poor, but the implications of urbanization are increasing their vulnerabilities. The railway informal settlement are within the responsibility of the city municipality, but because they're residing on the land belonging to the state railway, the municipality claims that they cannot provide services to the informal settlement because they're residing on the land that belongs to the state railway. And, in addition to this, to protect the surrounding expensive commercial and residential areas from flooding, diversion of flood water is drained into the informal settlement. most members of the community are in the informal economy. This means that when the Department of Land Transport of Khon Kaen Province decided to relocate the main coach station in the city in order to fulfill the provincial policy to become regional ASEAN hub and to establish the smart city, most members of the railway informal settlement lost their income because they were highly dependent on selling food to passengers at the coach station. And the new coach station is like 9 kilometers away, which is from the city, so it's too far for many of them to commute. To better understand urban risk and social vulnerabilities to climate change, we need to look beyond urbanization of the traditional city and even beyond simple dichotomies of urban and rural binaries, even between centralized and decentralized planning and decision-making processes, and between national and local governments, and even beyond just vertical and horizontal power relations.